If God does not exist, the Nazis were not wrong. It's just your opinion that they were wrong. If God does not exist, love is no better than rape. Not in an objective way anyway. You just may not like it. It's just unfashionable perhaps, but it's not really wrong. If God does not exist, blowing up innocent people watching a marathon is morally no different than feeding the poor. It's just your opinion. If God does not exist, religious crusades are not wrong. I had the opportunity to debate Christopher Hitchens a couple times. I love Christopher Hitchens. He was great. We had a lot of fun. He had a British accent, so he sounded even more brilliant than he was. And you could see both our debates on our website, crossexamined.org, for free. And Hitchens kept talking about all the evil religious people were doing in the Crusades. I say, Christopher, I agree with you. Exactly. But you know what? There's nothing wrong with that if there's no God. Because there's no standard of righteousness. If there's no standard of righteousness, nothing can be unrighteous. In fact, tolerance is no better than intolerance. David, with his organization, rightfully fights for tolerance for atheists. But look, if there's no God, why tolerate anything? Because there is no, in fact, there are no human rights if there is no God. Everything is a matter of opinion. If we're just overgrown germs that got here by some evolutionary process, then we're no different than any other animal. There is no objective morality if there is no God. Now, by the way, I didn't say atheists weren't good people. I didn't say atheists couldn't know morality. What I'm saying here is atheists can't justify morality.
If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Many theists and atheists alike concur on this point. For example, the late J.L. Mackie of Oxford University, one of the most eminent atheists of our day, admitted if there are objective values, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. Thus, we have a defensible argument from morality to the existence of a God. But in order to avoid God's existence, Mackie therefore denied that objective moral values exist. He wrote, "It is easy to explain this moral sense as a natural product of biological and social evolution." Professor Michael Roos, a philosopher of science at the University of Guelph, agrees. He explains, "Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself,' they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." Friedrich Nietzsche, the great atheist of the last century who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the destruction of all meaning and value in life. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right. But we've got to be very careful here. The question here is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? I'm not claiming that we must. Nor is the question, can we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? I think that we can. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values exist? Like Mackie and Roos, I just don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, the morality evolved by Homo sapiens is objective. After all, if there is no God, then what's so special about human beings? They're just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe, and which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On the atheistic view, some actions, say rape, may not be socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development has become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is really wrong. On the atheistic view, apart from the social consequences, there's nothing really wrong with your raping someone. Thus, without God, there is no absolute right and wrong which imposes itself on our conscience. But the problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down we all know it. There is no more reason to deny the existence of objective moral values than the existence of objective physical objects in the world. Actions like rape, torture, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, and self-sacrifice are really good. But if objective values cannot exist without God, and objective values do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that God exists. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. By objective moral values, I mean moral values which are valid and binding, whether we believe in them or not. Many theists and atheists agree that if God does not exist, then moral values are not objective in this way. Michael Ruse, a noted philosopher of science, explains, the position of the modern evolutionist is that morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Like Professor Ruse, I just don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, the morality which has emerged among these imperfectly evolved primates we call Homo sapiens is objective. And here Mr. Hitchens seems to agree with me. He says moral values are just innate predispositions ingrained into us by evolution. Such predispositions, he says, are inevitable for any animal endowed with social instincts. On the atheistic view, then, an action like rape is not socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development has become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is really morally wrong. On the atheistic view, there's nothing really wrong with raping someone. But the problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down we all know it. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of objective moral goods and evils. Actions like rape, cruelty, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior, they're moral abominations. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, and self-sacrifice are really good. But then it follows logically and necessarily that God exists. The moral argument. Here he says that you have to prove that people would behave better if they believed in God. That's not the argument. I hope that's clear to everyone. The argument is that without God as a transcendent foundation for moral values, we're simply lost in sociocultural relativism. Who are you to judge that the Nazi ethic was wrong? Who are you to judge that the ethic of ancient Hinduism was wrong? Who are you to judge that the Afrikaner apartheid is wrong? This is all just the result of sociocultural evolution, and there is no transcendent objective standard apart from God, and that's what God delivers for us. Now, Mr. Hitchens says, name one moral action that an unbeliever could not take. Well, that's trivially easy. If God exists, there are all kinds of moral duties that we have that the unbeliever could not recognize. At the panel discussion last week in Dallas, when Mr. Hitchens demanded that someone name such an action, a pastor on the panel immediately piped up, how about tithing? Well, leave it to a pastor to think of that, but clearly that's an action that only a believer would take. Even more fundamentally, what about the first and greatest commandment? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your mind. That is an action that only a believer can take. No unbeliever can discharge even this most fundamental of moral duties. But in any case, all of this is beside the point with respect to the moral argument. The point is that on atheism, there are no moral obligations for anybody to fulfill. In nature, whatever is right, and Mr. Hitchens is unable to provide any sort of objective foundation for moral values. Massimo Pigliucci is a philosopher of biology. This is what he has to say. He says, on atheism, there is no such thing as objective morality. Morality in human cultures has evolved, and what is moral for you might not be moral for the guy next door, and certainly is not moral for the guy across the ocean. And what makes you think that your personal morality is the one and everybody else is wrong? What we call homicide or rape, he said, is very, very common among different kinds of animals. Lions, for example, commit infanticide on a regular basis. Now, are these kinds of acts to be condoned? I don't even know what that means, because the lion doesn't understand what morality is. Morality, he says, is an invention of human beings. It's just a convention that human beings have adopted to live together, but it has no objectivity. And that's what I offer Mr. Hitchens tonight, is a solid, transcendent foundation for the moral values that I think he so desperately wants to affirm.
¿Puedes tú ser bueno sin Dios? Veamos. Absolutamente asombroso. Ahí lo tienes. Prueba innegable de que tú sí puedes ser bueno sin creer en Dios. Pero espera, la pregunta no es, ¿puedes tú ser bueno sin creer en Dios? La pregunta es, ¿puedes tú ser bueno sin Dios? Aquí es donde se encuentra el problema. Si Dios no existe, ¿qué fundamento permanece para la objetividad del bien o el mal, de lo correcto o incorrecto? Si Dios no existe, los valores morales objetivos no existen. Y aquí está el porqué. Sin algún punto de referencia objetivo, no tenemos forma de decir que algo está realmente arriba o abajo. La naturaleza de Dios proporciona un punto de referencia objetivo para los valores morales, que es la norma o patrón contra el cual se miden todas las acciones y decisiones. Pero si Dios no existe, entonces no existe ningún punto de referencia objetivo. Todo lo que nos queda es el punto de vista de una persona, el cual no es más válido que el punto de vista de cualquier otra persona. Esa clase de moralidad es subjetiva, no objetiva. Es como tener una preferencia por el helado de fresa. La preferencia se encuentra en el sujeto, no en el objeto, de manera que eso no se aplica a otras personas. De la misma forma, la moralidad subjetiva se aplica solamente al sujeto. No es válida ni obligatoria para nadie más. Así que, en un mundo sin Dios, no puede haber ni mal ni bien, nada sino una indiferencia ciega y despiadada. Dios ha expresado su naturaleza a nosotros por medio de mandamientos. Esos mandamientos proporcionan la base para los deberes morales. Por ejemplo, el atributo esencial de Dios del amor es expresado en su mandamiento «Ama a tu prójimo como a ti mismo». Ese mandamiento proporciona un fundamento sobre el cual podemos afirmar la bondad objetiva de la generosidad, la abnegación y la equidad. Y asimismo podemos condenar la maldad objetiva de la avaricia, el abuso, la discriminación y la opresión. Esto presenta un problema. ¿Es algo bueno simplemente porque Dios lo desea? ¿O Dios desea algo porque eso es bueno? La respuesta es ninguna de las dos. Más bien, Dios desea algo porque Él es bueno. Dios es el estándar de los valores morales de la misma manera que una actuación musical en vivo es el estándar para una grabación de alta fidelidad. Mientras una grabación suene más como la original, mucho mejor será. De la misma manera, mientras una acción moral se conforme más a la naturaleza de Dios, mucho mejor será. Pero si el ateísmo es verdadero, entonces no existe un estándar definitivo, de modo que no puede haber ninguna obligación o deber moral. ¿Quién o qué impone tales deberes sobre nosotros? Nadie. Recuerda, para el ateo, los seres humanos son solo accidentes de la naturaleza, animales altamente evolucionados. Pero los animales no tienen obligaciones morales los unos para con los otros. Cuando un gato mata a un ratón, él no ha hecho nada moralmente malo. El gato simplemente está siendo un gato. Si Dios no existe, entonces deberíamos considerar el comportamiento humano de la misma manera. Ninguna acción debería ser considerada moralmente correcta o incorrecta, pero el problema es que el bien y el mal, lo correcto e incorrecto sí existen, así como nuestra experiencia sensorial nos convence de que el mundo físico es objetivamente real.
¡Ay!
Nuestra experiencia moral nos convence de que los valores morales son objetivamente reales. Cada vez que tú dices, «Oye, eso no es justo, eso está mal, eso es una injusticia», Estás afirmando tu creencia en la existencia de la moralidad objetiva. Estamos conscientes de que el abuso infantil, la discriminación racial y el terrorismo son incorrectos para todas las personas siempre. ¿Es esto simplemente una preferencia u opinión personal? No. El hombre que dice que es socialmente aceptable violar a niños menores está tan equivocado como el hombre que dice que 2 más 2 es igual a 5. Entonces, a todo lo que esto conlleva es un argumento moral para la existencia de Dios. Si Dios no existe, los valores y deberes morales objetivos no existen. Pero los valores y deberes morales sí existen. Por lo tanto, Dios existe. El ateísmo no proporciona un fundamento para la realidad moral que cada uno de nosotros experimentamos todos los días. De hecho, la existencia de la moralidad objetiva nos apunta directamente hacia la existencia de Dios.